del presidente, bastardos del empresario, bastardos del presidente, bastardos del empresario, bastardos del presidente, bastardos del empresario, bastardos del presidente, bastardos del empresario. Ahí están, ellos son los que matan sin razón. Ahí están, ellos son los que matan sin razón. Ahí están, ellos son los que matan sin razón.
Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel, where I'm your host, an untitled anarchist seagull apparently. Today we're going to have another chapter of Chile, the Dictionary of Struggle, where our topic is going to be La Cocina Constituyente. The English language media have been doing their customary absolute crap job of covering what's going on in Chile, to the extent that I'm actually hardly seeing any reporting in English language media at this point. The general idea seems to have been that normality returned when far-right President Sebastián Piñera, with his proud approval rating of 6%, got together with various politicians from both his coalition and the nominal opposition, who together have an approval rating of 3%, to come up with what was called an agreement for social peace and the new constitution. Since then, the repression has continued. The human rights situation there remains quite dire. And it may surprise you to hear this, but actually the figures in terms of both deaths likely attributable to state action, cases of torture, cases of political imprisonment, all of them are actually well above the average of the Pinochet dictatorship. Interestingly, there has been very little interest in commenting much further on that. Well, there continue to be people dying in the protests. The main way in which people are getting killed these days is that the military police, who we talked about the last time, los Paco Culiao, they will attack the medical aid first responders who are trying to treat somebody who has a life-threatening injury, thus making it impossible for that person's life to be saved. And I suppose the idea is that this avoids direct responsibility, but at the same time, it is very clearly attributable to the action of the military police. If they hadn't directly interfered with the attempts to save a person's life, the person would be alive today. That has been happening on a fairly regular basis in recent weeks at Plaza de la Dignidad in Santiago, which was formerly known as Plaza Italia, and the struggle now continues. We're now on the 118th day of what some media refer to as el estallido social, and others refer to as la revuelta or la revolución social. So, since one of the central demands for quite some time of the various mass popular movements that have been formed in Chile over the past decade has been a new constitution, we're going to talk about what the government's response to that has been, apart from simply trying to kill people and putting their eyes out. There are now over 400 people who have had their eyes put out by the military police, incidentally. So if you got the impression that things were back to normal and there was nothing to see anymore, you've been lied to. If anything, this is a time when there needs to be as much attention as possible, because the only thing that was really keeping the repression is somewhat in check was the fact that there was a large amount of international interest. Now that people are, for the most part, not even really noticing what's going on outside of Chile, it seems that the state has decided to really crack down as hard as they possibly can. One of the most recent developments there was that a new law was passed to allow Piñera, in his sole discretion, to send the military onto the streets on the pretext of protecting critical infrastructure. He is also, in his sole discretion, allowed to give the soldiers involved immunity from prosecution for anything that he might decide in his sole and totally legitimate discretion. I mean, there are 6% of the population behind him on this, with a 5% margin for error. So, I mean, obviously, that's legit. And the nominal opposition, of course, so eagerly signed on to this after making a show of tanking the attempt to impeach him, and most recently sabotaging the attempts to impeach the regional governor of the metropolitan region, Felipe Guevara, for his role in the killing and maiming of protesters in Santiago. When he isn't doing that, according to court records, he does have a habit of beating the shit out of his wife, so he is what is known in Chile as un chuche su madre. And this particular chuche su madre could have been kicked out of office, except that a couple of members of the opposition, nominal opposition, decided that this was a good time to absent themselves from the Congress, and so there was no quorum to do it. And that's basically where Chile is right now. But we're going to be talking about the soft power response to the demands for an end to the Constitution imposed by Augusto Pinochet in 1980 and maintained without any serious modification except to make it more right-wing than it already was since then. Now first let's have some history. Now, this cycle of mobilizations that has continued over the past 10 years, ebbing and flowing as they do, kicked off in around 2011 when students, particularly the secondary students, who have been really the main source of continuity for all of these mobilizations from the start, they've been out there risking their lives and their bodily integrity for longer than just about anyone, apart from perhaps the Mapuche, whose struggle has just never ended in centuries, really, and who have long faced the worst repression of any place in Chile. I mean, what people have pointed out actually is as bad as the repression is in Santiago and the major cities in the center and the north of the country. It's what they're actually seeing is what the Mapuche have been dealing with on a regular basis for decades. Now, the first demands, which are so familiar that nobody even really feels the need to say them because everybody has them memorized, for educación pública, gratuita, laica, de calidad. Secular, free, quality public education. Now, those demands have never been met. Yeah, although you could actually get the opposite impression from some of the rare media coverage of this internationally. Their university still remains extremely expensive. They've just sort of palliated a little bit by having scholarships for some people. It's all very means tested, and it's all still quite profitable. People are still barely able to function under the load of student debt that they end up with. And one of the most common threats since that cosmetic measure was introduced was to take it away from anyone who's involved in protests, and indeed that is continuing to be a threat because university education isn't free, and it's all in the end in the discretion of the state whether somebody who has no money will be allowed to go there at all. That movement really kicked off in 2011. And not long after, you also had the teachers and also the old age pensioners start to get in on it. They start because they're also being massively screwed over. especially the pension. Some people are living on less than $100 a month in a country where the cost of living actually, apart from rent, isn't all that different to North America or Europe. They've got North American and European prices on Latin American wages and pensions, and it is a very dangerous situation to be in economically. Is that the old age pensioners were also screwed over by Pinochet. One of Pinochet's signature measures was to privatize the pension system. Well, part of the pension system, most of the pension system. He decided to exempt certain people from this privatization. Specifically, the armed forces and the military police, who even today have the best pensions of anyone who isn't a CEO or a politician. They have had state pensions all along, and they are getting on the order of several times a month what people who have been paying in all their working lives to the privatized pension scam, the AFP, have. So that comes in. So you get the campaign No Más AFP. AFP stands for Pension Fund Associations. And it's a similar sort of scam to 401ks or the Riester-Rente in Germany, where the main people who are making any money at all on it are the fund managers, and people on a normal income simply are not going to be able to put together enough, especially considering the massive price fluctuations, to ever even hope to retire. So what you have then gradually over the first half of the decade is this discussion on these subjects and amongst all these movements, and this realization that really the problem still is the legacy of the dictatorship, particularly in the form of the 1980 Constitution. And so you start to have large marches starting in around, I think 2015 might have been the first one, for an Asamblea Constituyente, a constitutional assembly. The idea being that for the first time in the history of the state, the Constitution should be written on a participatory democratic basis, with local assemblies, territorial assemblies, where anyone could simply participate in deliberating and coming up with the principles of this new constitution. That was just utterly dismissed, except that Michelle Bachelet, who has now decided to reinvent herself as a supporter of human rights, which surprises particularly the Mapuche people who remember her time in office. She was notorious at the time to the extent that one of the most popular chants was Michelle, Michelle, que tiene Michelle, que mata y tortura igual que Pinochet. Michelle, Michelle, what's the deal with Michelle? That she kills and tortures just like Pinochet. That was her record, and now of course she's the High Commissioner for Human Rights and also a close friend of the current president. They're known to summer together. But she came out with the idea for a proceso constituyente, a constitutional process. Non-binding, there wasn't actually any end game in it. All it was there was going to be a phase of what was called educación ciudadana, where essentially government-organized town halls would tell people what the Constitution ought to look like. And then there would be some sort of incidencia on the part of the population. This was a term that generated a lot of controversy at the time, because incidencia is not the same thing as, say, participation. It doesn't mean that you have any power to decide anything. It means that you somehow have some possibly theoretical influence over the outcome, but not in any measurable direct sort of a way. And nothing really happened with this. They had these cabildos, town halls, all sort of organized under Bachelet's government, And, whatever happened to the records, nobody knows, although most likely they have ended up in the hands of the ANI, Chile's version of MI5, and possibly the Polcar, which is the political intelligence division of the military police. Because nothing ever happened with this thing, it just went nowhere, and the whole point, indeed, was to make it go nowhere, to sort of head off these demands for a direct participatory set of assemblies to draft a new constitution without the involvement, without the control of la clase política, the political class, the politicians who are largely, there's a strong tendency to dynasties. You have the same surnames from one generation to the next. In the Congress, in La Moneda, the presidential palace, it's basically the same people every single time. Or it's their sons and daughters and, cousins. It's an open joke that you really couldn't have any kind of sex scandals in the National Congress in Chile because it would actually technically be inbreeding. Everybody's cousin is somehow involved. Over a certain income threshold anyway. They have, according to polls, and this is going back again for most of the decade, have managed, and actually, according to Gabriel Salazar, in his excellent book, El Poder Constituyente de Asalariados e Intelectuales en el siglo XIX y siglo XX, siglo XX y XXI, the constitutional power of waged laborers and intellectuals in the 20th and 21st century. I managed to make the same mistake in both languages. In one of the final chapters, written in about 2006, he actually gives the figures for the approval rating at that time of the National Congress as a whole, as an institution, and it was about 11%. That was the case through this decade, and the earliest surveys that I actually started paying attention to around early 2012, figures for 2011 were also 10-11%, margin for error of 5%. So we're talking about a crisis of legitimacy of significant proportions that nobody feels represented by this Congress, apart from the people who by income you would kind of expect to, because they're the 10% who play golf with the people in Congress. They are, of course, terrified of what they call assembleísmo, assemblyism. It doesn't really translate. This idea that they could possibly be completely shut out of the process for determining the constitution of the country because they all know that if they don't control the process, chances are they will end up out of work at the end of it because nobody likes them. That was the Bachelet years. Now, of course, Piñera, the current president, when he came back in office, this decade has been just a repetition of presidents. The political class there has run out of ideas, and so they just kind of throw leftovers into the microwave. Bachelet had 2 terms, now Piñera's having 2. They don't know who the hell's they're going to find next. I mean, Aylwin's dead, and, Frey lost the last time, but maybe they'll just dig him up if they actually get a chance. But, or Lagos, who has the distinction of not being able to walk down the streets without a funa, i.e. people showing up, ordinary people showing up basically to tell him to fuck off. So who knows what the hell they'll do next time. Maybe they'll bring Bachelet back again. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if they get the chance.